This episode of Wheat Pete's Word is brought to you by Syngenta. Stack the deck in your favor in 2025 with a stacked cereals lineup of crop protection products from Syngenta. With proven technology for exceptional disease control and greater plant resilience, you'll find game-changing solutions for your wheat crop. Visit syngenta.ca for more info.
Good day, and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, March the 26th. On this episode of The Word, people are amazing. So neat. Season 25 is underway. We're out in the field. Some cool stuff to briefly talk about. And then, at the end, Agronomy answers till I once again run out of time. Let's go! Yes, people are amazing. Kevin from Essex, right out of the blue, saying, hey, Pete, I'm going to be going through your area. Where can I drop some local agricultural product off for you? And he did on his way through, and wow. So appreciated, Kevin. Absolutely not required, but Kevin just wanted to show his appreciation for the things that we've done over the years, and it just, man, I can't tell you how wonderful that makes you feel when you receive an act of kindness like that. Because I'm just doing my job, man. I'm just having some fun. But it is appreciated, and to recognize that is very, very neat. So it reminds me, by the way, of a really cool story from Nature Nut Nick. He's told me many times, or reminded me of this many times. And it happened when Nick was quite young. He was on a course. I don't remember the exact details, but he gave a presentation, and another person gave a presentation, very short, but just kind of about some topic, and the instructor was trying to show the impact of positive feedback. And so Nick got done, and right away the instructor it was very negative. Oh, I can't remember, but just very negative. It's like, you should have done this, you did that wrong, you did this wrong. Meanwhile, the other presenter, who not necessarily did any better job, maybe did a worse job, but all the feedback was positive. And then he kind of said, so will you do it again? And the answer was, like, for Nick, it was so impactful. Like, all you give me is negative feedback. Like, why would I ever do this again? For the other person, it was the total opposite. So, really, really appreciate when people give us some positive feedback here on The Word. Really cool, Kevin, that you would reach out and do that. Thank you so much. And, I will pay it forward, because I truly believe that these acts of kindness make far more impact than all the negativity that is out there, and we will continue to do as much of that as we can. By the way, one other really cool thing before I move on, Dave and Lisa telling me that every once in a while, on a nice day, when they're not too busy, they will go into town, they will buy some lunch, they will go to the local park and sit by the river, and they will listen to Wheat Pete's Word. And it's just like, yowza, a lunch date over Wheat Pete's Word. That has got to be a new one, and very, very cool. Okay, going to move on. Neil saying from St. Lawrence Grains, saying, Pete, I just want to tell you, man, the corn crop from 2024, the last load that arrived at his elevator, 62 pound per bushel test weight, 393 grams per half liter. And he's saying, and there's another grower going to start bringing corn in. They have a weather station on their farm, 4,000 heat units they got in 2024. And does that mean that corn will be 400 grams per half liter? Because this is the heaviest corn. Just such a great year in 2024. And Neil, when you're in a short seed area and test weight is always a bit of an issue, you can pretty much tell by when the corn tassels whether or not you will have good quality. Oh, I know things can happen, but man, it's just all about day length, and we've talked about this lots, but if you can get that corn to tassel in July, so your 60 days of grain fill is in August and September, when you're still getting some sunlight, some temperatures, it makes such a difference to the ability of that corn crop to finish and to actually give good test weight. And there's genetics, there's all those other factors. But yep, we had a long season. That long season relates to good grain quality and a nice situation to have. It's always easy to deal with a good quality crop. And so, season 25 is underway. Saturday night, man, she got cold here in southwestern Ontario. There was a whack, just a whack of ammonium sulfate in particular going out on the wheat crop. I think that's exactly correct. When you can get that ammonium sulfate on there early, it's March. Pretty early to put much nitrogen. You could put a little, but not very much. Certainly not more than 50 pounds. But that's absolutely what was going on. And so we are underway here. The next couple of weeks doesn't look like we're going to get much more of a chance to do that. So on those heavy clay soils where you don't get a chance to do it in April often because they're just wet, lots of things happen, and that's a good thing. Wheat survival as well is incredibly good across most of the area. We just are so fortunate that the snow melted slowly, no ponding. I scouted some fields yesterday that when they were planted last fall, Josh and I both said, well, they need to get wheat in this farm, but oh my gosh, the chances aren't very good. Planted the wheat. Wow. 95% of the field still has wheat, almost no ponding. It's very prone to ponding. And you can tell that it must have been a good winter. Some winter canola updates coming from Megan Moran down in Essex, where it looks like the winter canola, despite our concerns over how big it was last fall in some situations, sounds like most of that winter canola made it. I still have some winter canola to scout myself, where it was just too dry and the plants didn't get very big, so I'm not sure about that. They look a little thin on a drive past, but I haven't actually walked. But Andy from Mitchell saying, Pete, my daikon radish looks like it has overwintered. Is that, shouldn't it die? We have had issues with brassicas before overwintering. Mostly daikon radish dies. That big juicy root it's so full of water, and if you get any cold temperatures, it just freezes and takes it out. Andy, you must have had a lot of snow. If that daikon radish survives, it can. And I have seen situations where the oats died, where everything else died, but in our own Roots Not Iron trials a couple of years, the mustard that we had in actually did overwinter, and we had to take it out in the spring. And one year it got a little bit tough to get control early, and it all got to flower, and we had these nice yellow strips in the field, just the way that sometimes works. So a beautiful winter from that standpoint. The only concern we have really is snow mold. We've talked about that lots. Wim sending me a picture of two different varieties, significant difference in their snow mold susceptibility. The 25R65, much better than the 25R64. That's nothing against 25R64. We simply don't have that information. So cool if you have those variety comparisons, you're seeing a difference in snow mold, let us know. But at the end of the day, the biggest difference with snow mold is, did you apply manure and how big did it get in the fall? And it does look like the cereal rye, winter rye, is a little bit more susceptible to snow mold injury than some of the other species. All right, I want to move on. Talk really cool stuff that could make a big difference in the future, but will it? James Hutton Institute, they're out of Scotland, and they are doing some really cool work with spray-induced gene silencing. So this is along the same lines as epigenetics that I talked about a couple of episodes ago. But what they're doing is they're spraying double-stranded RNA, not DNA, but RNA, so that's the messenger, RNA, onto the crop that is specific to the disease organism. And in this case, they're working with fusarium on wheat to stop the fusarium from being able to infect the wheat crop. And what that RNA does is that it blocks protein production that the disease organism requires to produce or must produce in order to infect the wheat crop. So if the disease organism can't produce those proteins, it doesn't infect the crop. And they're being very cautious working on this because they know they can't affect the whole range of different pathogens and beneficial fungi that are out there, but it looks like it actually may not affect most other things, that it's quite specific to the Fusarium infection. So that is, I mean, gosh, if we could do that, just stop the fungus from being able to infect the Fusarium from being able to infect the wheat crop, that would be amazing. Hold onto your hat, though, because I've finished The Certainty Illusion by Timothy Caulfield. It should be required reading for virtually every student. However, I'm not going to go into details about that. The one thing, I will talk about it in the future because there's so much cool stuff there. But here's the point out of that book that I didn't realize. At least 90% of findings like epigenetics or like this spray-induced gene silencing or many of the other things that the new discoveries, at least 90% of them, even though they discovered them and they might work in the conditions in the lab, they actually don't work when we bring them out into the field or when we try to adapt them into the human population or whatever. So it's a 90% failure rate. We get all this hype, and actually Dr. Caulfield talks about this. We get all this hype because it could do this, and then it never comes to reality. So just don't get sold down the hype trail. Johnson's bad for it. I hype things up like crazy because I always want to be on the positive side, but it doesn't always work. I think this is really cool technology. They have done some field trials. It did look like it would work, but it's not here quite yet. Let's hope that it comes through to fruition. Let's go on to the agronomy answers. So great question from Kevin asking about soybeans, and Eric from black beans. The same question. All right, better to do 15-inch rows or twin 30s. So in Kevin's situation, he's got a 15-inch bar, he's got 12 units, and he's saying, how do I put them on the bar? So my first question, Kevin, because oftentimes those units, you won't be able to push them close enough to actually get to 10-inch centers. Most units don't go down to that, but let's assume you can do that. Which is better, 15-inch rows or twin 30s? And I'm pretty sure everybody is saying, well, Peter's going to say 15-inch rows because we just know the way that wheat peat is. And you're correct. 15-inch rows are going to space the plants out better. They're going to canopy faster. And the faster canopy gives me better weed interference. So I'm a 15-inch row guy, but Kevin says, you know, I'm planting those soybeans between 30-inch corn. Now you got to back up 2 steps and say, okay, so if I'm going to plant between those 30-inch corn rows and I go to 15-inch rows, does that mean my depth gauge wheels are now bouncing over the root balls of the corn plants? Because that means I give up my seed depth accuracy. So there's a practical part of this, and in Kevin's case, he says, I might even go to a strip till between the old corn rows. Man, if you want to strip till between the corn rows to get a little boost out of some tillage, not that that boost necessarily gives you yield, but it absolutely does give you some early growth. If you're going to do that, then your 10-inch twins may well be better than 15-inch row soybeans because you'll keep that planting unit off the old root balls. In the same case with the Eric's black beans, I think the same thing holds true. Although I do think that with black beans, because they're a shorter plant, they don't canopy quite as quickly, or they don't build as big a canopy. I even more push to 15s than I do twin 30s. But it's often never as simple as you would think it should be. 15-inch rows for weed control, but you have to look at the practicalities of doing that planting. Tom from Essex had a great discussion with Tom. He came up to me at the grain farmers meeting and talked about a few things. One was nitrogen on soybeans, saying, like, can I put some nitrogen on my soybeans to get a boost early? I'm a no-till farmer, and would that help? And so we do know from the work that Sean Conley has done in Wisconsin that in cold climates, you can get some added growth. And Horst has seen this in Ontario as well. But Tom, in Essex County, the chances of adding yield from that 30 pounds of nitrogen is really, really slim. And so then Tom went on to say, well, what about a pop-up effect that I could get if I put it on, in the soil as a sideband. And what's really interesting about that discussion is we always talk about starter fertilizers as giving us a pop-up effect. But in actual fact, they slow down germination. If you compare, and I've talked about this before, I know, but if you compare wheat seed that you put MAP with the seed versus seed that you do not put MAP with, man, the seed without the MAP comes up first every time. And that is because the fertilizer takes the water first. So this concept of a pop-up effect, we actually slow germination, but because we have that high concentration of nutrients right there in the early growth of the crop so that it can get more rapid growth, even though it emerges later, the growth is enough faster, particularly on grass crops, particularly on corn, on wheat, on barley, on those crops that have that high phosphorus demand early. The crop grows that much faster that by a week or 10 days, it looks like it came up first, even though it did not. In the case of soybeans, man, they don't have big demand early, so you're not going to get quite as much pop-up effect just because they don't have that big phosphorus demand early. All right, moving on, and Gord asking a great question, says, okay, Pete, we're talking about sulfur on wheat, and we're looking at all this sulfate data. We're going to drone some sulfur, some ammonium sulfate onto my wheat crop. How much early sulfate do I need to get that yield bump? And that is such a great question, Gord, because number one, we're not even sure the real yield bump is real, but the data is pushing us there, and it really is pushing us to the sulfate. But if I look at the trials that are out there, it sort of looks like I don't need that much sulfur early. In fact, in the Kent County trials that Brian Coots with Hensel Co-op did, they had only 5 pounds of sulfur. So I think in that situation, with a drone, if you can keep the amount down, they're much more efficient. They're going to charge you less per acre. I think if you could put on 40 pounds, 50 pounds, maybe even 30 pounds of ammonium sulfate, so we get into that 5 pound per acre of sulfur range early, and put the rest of the sulfur on later, either as sulfate or as ATS. As much as I'm not an ATS proponent quite as much anymore, I think that would be a really cool trial to do to see if we could get that yield bump. Joe saying, hey, Peter, all this sulfur talk, can I put 4 gallons of ATS with my herbicide when I spray the wheat? And anybody who has listened to this podcast very long is already saying, oh yeah, here we go. No, don't do it. Oh gosh, ammonium thiosulfate is incredibly salty. It burns. Man, just no fertilizer with the herbicide, full stop. That's where I'm at, and certainly not ammonium thiosulfate. Peter Sickman and Mike Cobra did some of those trials, and you might not hurt yield, but you will burn the crop, and anytime you burn the crop, wheat peat is out. Steve saying, all right, I have in my silo a blend of 28% and ammonium thiosulfate, and it's a 9-to-1 ratio of nitrogen to sulfur. I'm going to put on 80 units of nitrogen early. Is that enough sulfur? And so when you do that math, if it's 80 pounds of nitrogen, that's 9 pounds of total sulfur in the ammonium thiosulfate, the ATS. Half of that is all the sulfate sulfur we're going to get, plus we don't get it as early. It still takes time for that ATS to transform to the sulfate form. And in my thought process, that's just not enough. I'd really like to see more ATS in that first shot, more potential sulfur in that first shot. Steve's going to come back with 50 to 70 of that later. So that, if we say 60 pounds, so that's 6 pounds basically of more sulfur. It's a total of 15. But only 7.5 would be sulfate sulfur. And so my conversation with Steve ended up with Steve saying, next year I don't think I'll blend it into the silo, that we just have to be able to dial in, depending on crop, what we want to do. So we need to keep those separate. And yeah, that's sort of where I'm at as well, Steve. It stores in a blend, but then you're locked in, and that isn't always a good thing. Andrew saying, all right, Peter, urea plus AMS on my wheat crop versus Amidas, and Amidas, of course, is a 40-00 5.5 sulfur, and the sulfur is in the sulfate form. And when you think about that, so a couple of things. Andrew also says we're going to broadcast it. Well, Andrew, if you're going to broadcast it, urea and ammonium sulfate don't broadcast well together. Urea is a very light granule. Ammonium sulfate is a very heavy granule. They don't spread the same with a spinner spreader. So that's issue one. And then maybe the Amidas is better. But as far as this every prill having sulfur, I'm not worried about that because we're putting on 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate. We do that as a single application. There's enough sulfur out there, and sulfur moves in the soil. It's not where we need to have it in every prill, and it basically is anyway in the ammonium sulfate. The only thing would be the spread pattern. And then Andrew said, well, by the way, Peter, if I do the Amidas, it's $100 an acre more. Or pardon me, $100 a ton more rather in comparison. And I'm just going, man, if it costs you more, just use the urea AMS and make sure that you do a good job of spreading. All right, last question here to answer. Pete saying, hey, poison oak or poison ivy, how do I get rid of them? I have one fence row we're taking out. It's full of poison oak. How do I kill it? Another fence row where we want to leave the grass, but we want to kill the poison ivy, the poison oak. So with poison oak, the only product that really works well, Pete, is triclopyr or Garlon. So get some Garlon for the fence row you want to leave, but kill the poison oak, the poison ivy. The Garlon will take out the poison oak. It should have efficacy on the poison ivy. If not, 2,4-D mecaprop combinations do a good job on poison ivy. Where you're taking the whole fence row out, you want to kill everything, it's called glyphosate. Glyphosate will still do a good job and doesn't leave residual, all of those kind of things. But poison oak, pretty specific. The active there, or the product there, is Garlon in order to leave the grass and take out that poison oak. And with that, we are out of time. That's it. That's all on behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture. This is Wheat Pete with the word for Wednesday, March the 26th. Hey, this is the last one in March. April's a-coming. Keep the messages, keep the feedback coming, and we will talk way too long yet again next week. See you then.